Have you ever seen someone abuse their power so sure they're untouchable? What happens when the person they target holds a secret that can shatter their entire world in an instant? We're not talking about a complaint to customer service. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar corporate takeover. A flight attendant drunk on her own authority unleashes a tirade of disrespect on a black woman in first class. But she has no idea she's just publicly humiliated the new owner of the entire airline. Stay with us as we unfold the shocking real-life drama of karma, served at 30,000 feet. The recycled air of Sterling Airlines Flight 812 from Atlanta to New York tasted stale, a familiar blend of jet fuel cleaning solution and faint anxiety. For Dr. Althea Washington, it was the taste of another Tuesday. At 48, she had spent more time in aluminum tubes, hurtling through the stratosphere than she had in her own bed. Her company, Phoenix Equity Group, had just closed the most significant acquisition of its 10-year history, the purchase of Sterling Airlines, a legacy carrier struggling under the weight of debt and a tarnished reputation. Althea, the architect of the deal, was flying to LaGuardia for the official press conference and the first of many brutal board meetings. She settled into seat 2B, a plush leather cocoon in first class that was both her office and her sanctuary. Her charcoal gray suit was impeccable, the silk of her blouse a soft whisper against her skin. Her hair was styled in elegant shoulder-length locks, each one a testament to her patience and heritage. She was the very picture of composed power, yet, to the flight attendant working the first-class cabin, she was apparently invisible. The flight attendant's name tag read Brenda. She was a woman in her late 50s with a helmet of stiff blonde hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Brenda moved through the cabin with a practiced, almost aggressive efficiency. She offered pre-departure champagne to the man in 2A, a portly executive already red-faced from a lunchtime cocktail. She chirped at the woman in 1C, a socialite dripping in gold jewelry. When she passed Althea, however, her eyes slid over her as if she were a part of the seat. No greeting, no offer of a drink. Althea, accustomed to the subtle and not-so-subtle slights that came with being a black woman in predominantly white spaces, let the first pass slide. She was busy reviewing financial projections on her tablet, her mind a whirlwind of numbers and strategy. It was only when Brenda made a second pass, topping off the executive's champagne and pointedly ignoring Althea's discreetly raised hand, that a familiar coil of frustration began to tighten in her gut. "Excuse me, Althea," said her voice calm but firm, the kind of voice that could command a boardroom. Brenda stopped, her body angled away from Althea. She turned her head slowly, her expression a mask of strained patience. "Yes, I'd like a glass of water, please. No ice." Brenda's smile thinned. "We'll begin our full beverage service after takeoff." She turned to leave before the words had fully settled. "The other passengers have drinks," Althea noted, keeping her tone even. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Brenda pivoted back, her movements sharp. "They requested them before we began final preparations for departure." The lie was so blatant, so unnecessary, it took Althea's breath away. The man in 2A had received his second glass less than a minute ago. Althea held Brenda's gaze. "I see. Well, I'm requesting one now." For a moment, the two women were locked in a silent battle of wills. The air between them crackled. Brenda's facade of customer service finally crumbled, replaced by a sneer of pure condescension. "We are about to push back from the gate," she said, her voice rising just enough to turn the heads of the other passengers. You'll have to wait." With a dismissive flick of her wrist, Brenda turned and marched toward the galley, her back ramrod straight. The man in 2A snickered into his champagne flute. The woman in 1C studiously examined her manicure. Althea felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation creep up her neck. It was the petty, everyday racism that was so exhausting. It wasn't a physical blow, but an erosion of the spirit, a constant reminder that no matter her achievements, her wealth, or her status, in the eyes of some, her skin color would always define her and diminish her. She took a slow, deep breath, centering herself. She could have escalated. She could have pulled out her phone and found the direct line to Sterling's outgoing CEO, Franklin Reed, and had Brenda removed from the flight. But that wasn't her style. This was a teaching moment, a data point. She was no longer just a passenger. She was an owner, and this was her company. This was her problem to solve. The flight took off without incident. As soon as the seatbelt sign pinged off, Brenda reappeared with her beverage cart. She served the other passengers with exaggerated warmth, her laughter tinkling through the cabin. When she finally reached Althea, she placed a plastic cup of water on her tray table. Without a word, the gesture dripping with contempt. Althea looked at the plastic cup, then back at Brenda's impassive face. Every other passenger had been served in heavy glass tumblers. Brenda Althea said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Is there a reason I've been given a plastic cup?" Brenda's eyes narrowed. "We're running low on glassware." Another lie. Althea could see at least a dozen clean glasses gleaming on the cart. "Is that so?" Althea picked up her tablet and tapped the screen a few times. "Because I'm looking at the catering manifest for this flight right now. It shows a full stock of 24 first-class glasses was loaded in Atlanta." Brenda's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a splotchy, mottled pink. How could you possibly have that?" I have it," Althea said, her voice like steel. "Just like I have the complete employee file for one Brenda Walsh, an employee with 17 years of service, and I see a rather shocking number of passenger complaints, most of them citing rudeness and discriminatory behavior, all of which seem to have been quietly misplaced by middle management." Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The man in 2A was no longer snickering. He was staring his eyes wide. "I don't know who you think you are," Brenda hissed, her voice a venomous whisper, but the bravado was gone, replaced by a tremor of fear. "Who I am," Althea said, standing up to her full height, "is the person who just bought this airline. My name is Dr. Althea Washington. I am the founder and CEO of Phoenix Equity Group, and as of 9 a.m. this morning, I own this plane and everything in it, including, for the moment, your contract." The silence in the first-class cabin was absolute, broken only by the hum of the engines. Brenda Walsh looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face, a moment before twisted in a sneer, was now a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock and dawning horror. The blood had not returned to her cheeks. Instead, they had taken on a grayish, sickly pallor. Her carefully constructed world of petty tyranny and unchallenged authority had just been vaporized by a woman she had dismissed as less than nothing. Althea let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her words to settle not just on Brenda, but on every passenger who had witnessed the exchange. The man in 2A now looked deeply uncomfortable, sinking into his seat as if trying to merge with the leather. The socialite in 1C stared, her perfectly glossed mouth hanging open. "So let's try this again," Althea said, her voice dropping back to its calm boardroom tone. "May I please have a glass of water in a glass tumbler with no ice. Brenda didn't move. She seemed frozen, her mind unable to process the cataclysmic shift in power that had just occurred. Her career, her pension, her entire professional life was flashing before her eyes, and the final image was of the calm, powerful black woman standing before her, a woman she had deliberately and repeatedly disrespected. From the front of the cabin, the lead flight attendant, a younger woman named Maria, had been watching with growing alarm. She hurried over her face, a mixture of concern and confusion. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" she asked, directing the question to Althea. Before Althea could answer, Brenda finally found her voice. But it wasn't a voice of apology or contrition. It was a shriek of defiance, the last gasp of a cornered animal. "She's lying!" Brenda screeched, pointing a trembling finger at Althea. "This woman is a lunatic. She's threatening me. She needs to be restrained." The outburst was so sudden, so unhinged, that it startled everyone. It was the kind of desperate self-destructive act that only happens when someone knows they are utterly, irrevocably finished. Brenda's shriek echoed in the pressurized quiet of the first-class cabin, a sharp, ugly sound that shattered the last vestiges of civility. "She's a lunatic. She needs to be restrained. Call the captain." Maria, the lead flight attendant, was a deer in the headlights caught between a passenger of clearly immense importance and a senior colleague who had just self-destructed. Her training manual had procedures for unruly passengers, for medical emergencies, for depressurization. It had no chapter for when a flight attendant accuses the new owner of the airline of being a deranged imposter. Althea, however, remained a pillar of calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look angry. She looked disappointed, the way a master craftsman might look at a beautiful piece of wood ruined by a single, careless cut. She held Maria's terrified gaze and spoke with quiet, unshakable authority. "Maria," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through Brenda's rising hysteria, "there will be no need to call the captain. This situation is under control. Brenda, however, is clearly unwell and is causing a disturbance. She is a liability to the safety and comfort of the other passengers. Please escort her to the galley and ensure she remains there for the duration of the flight. She is not to interact with any more passengers. Is that understood?" It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from the apex of the corporate food chain, delivered as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Brenda gaped at her. "You can't do that. I am the senior attendant in this cabin. You have no authority." "Oh, Brenda," Althea sighed, a flicker of something almost like pity in her eyes. "Your authority, your seniority, and your employment were all predicated on the assumption that you could perform your duties with a baseline of professional decorum. You have failed, spectacularly. Now you can either walk to the galley with your colleague or the air marshal on this flight, and yes, I know he's in seat 7D, can escort you. The choice is yours." The mention of the air marshal was a masterstroke. It demonstrated a level of knowledge so absolute, so far beyond that of a mere passenger, that it extinguished the last ember of Brenda's defiance. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a chilling, visceral fear. Her face crumpled. The helmet of blonde hair seemed to wilt. She looked for the first time like what she was, a frightened older woman who had just gambled away her future. Maria, galvanized by Althea's decisiveness, stepped forward. "Brenda, come on," she said softly, placing a hand on her arm. "Let's go." Brenda stumbled, allowing Maria to guide her toward the galley curtain. As she passed, her eyes met Althea's one last time. In them was not hatred, but a dawning, bottomless abyss of regret. The curtains swished shut behind them, muffling the sound of a choked sob. The first-class cabin was as quiet as a tomb. Althea slowly sat back down in seat 2B. She looked at the other passengers. The red-faced executive in 2A, whose name she now recalled from the passenger manifest, was a Mr. Henderson, was staring at his own reflection in his tablet's dark screen, studiously avoiding her gaze. He had been a silent co-signer of Brenda's disrespect, his snickering a small betrayal that Althea had duly noted. The socialite in 1C. Mrs. Dupont looked pale and shaken. The casual cruelty she'd witnessed had soured her champagne. A few moments later, Maria emerged from the galley, her composure regained. She approached Althea with a reverence usually reserved for royalty or deities. In her hands, she held a heavy glass tumbler of water condensation, beading on its side. "Dr. Washington," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Your water? I am so sorry for what happened. It was unprofessional and inexcusable." It was Althea agreed, accepting the glass. "But it was not your fault, Maria. Thank you for handling it. Brenda is—" "She's very upset," Maria offered, hesitating. "I imagine she is," Althea said, taking a cool sip of water. "Change can be upsetting." She looked at Maria, truly seeing her for the first time. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with bright, intelligent eyes. She was poised under pressure. She recognized and respected authority. She was, in short, exactly the kind of employee Sterling Airlines desperately needed. "How long have you been with Sterling, Maria?" Althea asked, her tone shifting from command to conversation. "5 years, ma'am." "Dr. Washington. And in those 5 years, have you witnessed behavior like Brenda's?" Before Maria's face was a painful conflict of loyalty to a colleague and the duty to tell the truth. There have been complaints," she admitted carefully. "Brenda is from a different era of the airline." "The era of coffee, tea, or me, you mean," Althea said, with a wry, humorless smile. "An era that ended about 40 years ago. An era, I assure you, that will have no place in the new Sterling Airlines." She took another sip of water, her eyes sweeping over the cabin. "Tell me, Maria, if you were in charge of in-flight services, what is the first thing you would change?" The question caught Maria completely off guard. This wasn't just a passenger making conversation. This was a test. This was an interview at 30,000 feet. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. I think the training, ma'am," she finally said, her confidence growing as she spoke. "It's all about procedures, safety protocols, service steps. It's a checklist. We're never really trained on the why. Why treating every single person with dignity matters. Why a plastic cup can feel like an insult. We're not taught to think about the passenger's experience from an emotional standpoint. It's all just process." Althea listened, nodding slowly. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "That's a very good answer, Maria. A very good answer indeed." She leaned back in her seat, the cool glass a comforting weight in her hand. The crisis was contained, but the work she knew had just begun. The issue wasn't just one bitter flight attendant. It was the different era Maria had spoken of. It was a corporate culture that had allowed a Brenda Walsh to flourish for 17 years, her bigotry and insolence. Not just tolerated, but protected. The unraveling hadn't ended when Brenda was escorted to the galley. It was just starting. And Althea was already looking past this one flight, past LaGuardia to the boardroom. She was thinking about the people who had signed Brenda's paychecks, ignored her complaints, and perpetuated the system that had produced her. Their threads were all part of the same ugly tapestry, and she was here to pull every single one of them loose. For the remaining 90 minutes of the flight, a strange, sanctified quiet permeated the first-class cabin. It was as if a spell had been broken. The air, which had been thick with tension and unspoken prejudice, now felt clear, albeit intensely awkward. Maria and the other flight attendant, a quiet young man named David, moved through the cabin with a newfound purpose. Their service was not just efficient, it was intentional. Every "can I get you anything else" was imbued with a silent apology for the ugliness that had transpired. Mr. Henderson, in 2A, pointedly read the Wall Street Journal, the paper held up like a shield. Mrs. Dupont, in 1C, requested a blanket and feigned sleep. They were no longer just passengers on a flight. They were witnesses, unwilling participants in a corporate drama that was far from over. Althea, for her part, appeared to be engrossed in her tablet. In reality, she was orchestrating the next act. Using the plane's sluggish Wi-Fi, she sent a single encrypted email to two people. Jordan Vance, the ruthless but brilliant COO she had brought with her from Phoenix Equity, and Sarah Chen, her incoming head of human resources, a woman known for her ability to dismantle toxic work environments with surgical precision. The email was brief. Subject: asset, insubordination. Flight: A12, body Jordan Sarah. We have a Code 1 personnel issue on my flight. A senior flight attendant, Brenda Walsh. Racially motivated insubordination. Public disturbance. I have contained the situation in flight. I need you both to meet the plane at the gate she at LGA. No airport security. I want Sterling's VP of in-flight services, Mark Jenkins, and the station manager for LaGuardia there as well. I will deplane last. Handle Ms. Walsh's exit with professional discretion but absolute finality. This is ground zero for the culture change. Althea. She hit send. The small swoosh sound was a death knell for a career and a warning shot for an entire corporate division. She spent the rest of the flight observing. She watched Maria console David, who was clearly rattled by the confrontation. She saw how they worked together, a seamless team, trying to mend the rift Brenda had torn in the fabric of the flight. They were good people caught in a bad system. She made a mental note. Protect the Mariahs and the Davids. As the plane began its descent into the hazy skies over Queens, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent arrival. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his voice. Althea suspected that Maria had followed protocol and informed him of the disturbance in the cabin. The news of what happened was likely already rippling through the aircraft's crew. When the plane finally docked at the gate at LaGuardia, the usual chaos of deplaning began. Economy passengers shuffled out weary and oblivious. The first-class passengers, however, were hesitant. Mr. Henderson practically bolted from his seat, muttering a hasty, "Excuse me," without making eye contact. Mrs. Dupont gathered her things and scurried away, a woman fleeing the scene of a crime. Althea remained seated calmly, sipping her water as she had promised in her email. She watched through the window as the ground crew connected the jet bridge. And then she saw them. Standing just inside the terminal, framed by the large windows of the gate area, was her team. Jordan Vance was a tall, imposing man in a razor-sharp suit, his expression grim. Beside him, Sarah Chen, smaller in stature, but radiating an aura of intense competence, held a slim portfolio. Flanking them were two men who looked deeply uncomfortable. One was a portly man, with a florid face and a panicked look in his eyes. Althea correctly identified him from his corporate headshot as Mark Jenkins, the VP of In-Flight Services. The other was the station manager, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. The stage was set. Maria approached Althea's seat. "Dr. Washington, we're all clear." "Thank you, Maria," Althea said, gathering her briefcase and tablet. She paused and looked at the young woman. "You handled a very difficult situation with grace and professionalism today." "That has been noted." Maria's eyes widened and she nodded, unable to speak. Althea walked to the galley. The curtain was drawn. She pulled it back slightly. Brenda Walsh was sitting on a jump seat, her face streaked with tears, her makeup a mess. She looked up, her eyes filled with a desperate pleading hope. "Dr. Washington, please, my pension." 17 years, she began to babble. Althea cut her off, not with cruelty, but with finality. "What happens now is no longer my concern, Brenda. It is an HR matter." She let the curtain fall closed. She turned and walked out of the aircraft, the last passenger, to deplane. As she stepped into the Giant Bridge, Jordan Vance and Sarah Chen moved forward to greet her, parting to let her pass like the sea before Moses. Althea Jordan said, his voice a low rumble. "Situation contained." "For now," Althea replied, not breaking her stride. She walked directly up to the sweating vice president. "Mr. Jenkins," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute power. "I am Dr. Althea Washington. I had a deeply unsatisfactory experience on one of your flights today." Mark Jenkins flinched, as if he'd been tasered. "Dr. Washington, an honor. I am so terribly sorry for whatever happened. I assure you we will deal with it. The employee will be disciplined to the fullest." Althea held up a hand, silencing him. "The employee is a symptom, Mr. Jenkins, not the disease. The disease is a culture that allows an employee with a documented history of bigoted behavior to remain in a customer-facing role for 17 years. A history that I am certain crossed your desk multiple times. That disease is your responsibility, and I am the cure." She didn't wait for a response. She turned to Sarah Chen. "Sarah, please handle Ms. Walsh's termination. Standard severance is not applicable in cases of gross misconduct. Have her sterling ID and credentials revoked immediately. Escort her out through a private exit. Be humane, but be firm. There is no path back for her." "Understood," Sarah said, her gaze already fixed on the plane's door, from which Brenda was now being escorted by a grim-faced David. Althea then turned her attention back to the terrified VP. "Mr. Jenkins, you and I will be meeting in my new office at headquarters at 8 a.m. tomorrow. You will bring with you the complete unredacted personnel files for every single flight attendant and pilot who has had more than 3 passenger complaints in the last 5 years. You will also bring the files of every complaint that was dismissed without action. We are going to do a full audit of your department, and of you." She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his panicked eyes. "I suggest you get some sleep, Mr. Jenkins. It's going to be a very long day for you tomorrow." With that, she swept past him, Jordan at her side, leaving the VP of In-Flight Services standing in the middle of the gate area, pale and trembling, as the ghost of his career floated out of the airplane door behind him. The landing was complete, but the shock waves were just beginning to spread. News in the airline industry travels faster than a tailwind. Before Brenda Walsh had even been escorted out of the airport, whispers of the incident on 8/12 were already flickering across employee message boards and private WhatsApp groups. By the time Althea's car was speeding towards Manhattan, the story had mutated into a full-blown corporate legend. A flight attendant in first class went full Karen on a black woman. Turns out the woman was some kind of secret shopper, a corporate spy. I heard she fired her on the spot right in the aisle, and then she fired the captain for not stopping it. The truth, when it finally solidified, was even more shocking. The woman wasn't a secret shopper. She was the new god of Sterling Airlines, and she had personally overseen the termination of a 17-year veteran before the plane's engines had even cooled. A tremor of fear and excitement shot through the company's 30,000 employees. For the many who were weary of the toxic, crony-driven culture of the old Sterling, it was a moment of hope. For the cronies themselves, it was a terrifying omen. The ripple effect wasn't contained within the company. Mr. Henderson, the executive from Seat 2A, was the CEO of a mid-level tech firm that had a corporate travel account with sterling worth over $2 million a year. He spent the entire ride to his hotel in a cold sweat. His silent, snickering complicity now felt like a catastrophic business error. That evening, a lavish fruit basket and a groveling handwritten apology note were dispatched to the presidential suite of the St. Regis where Althea was staying. Althea had her assistant send a polite but chillingly formal email in response. Dr. Washington appreciates your sentiment. She believes that actions, not apologies, are the true measure of character and corporate responsibility. Mr. Henderson spent the next week drafting a new mandatory inclusivity training program for his own company. The first official press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. the next morning in a grand ballroom at a hotel near Wall Street. It was meant to be a standard dry affair. Franklin Reed, the outgoing CEO, would read a prepared statement formally pass the torch, and Althea would speak about fiscal responsibility and synergy. But the story had already set the narrative. The room was buzzing. Business reporters from the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg were now joined by journalists from the New York Times and CNN who smelled a much more interesting human story. Franklin Reed, a man in his late 60s with the leathery tan of a lifelong golfer, seemed oblivious. He droned on about Sterling's proud history. When he introduced Althea, he did so with a slightly patronizing air, calling her a dynamic new force in the industry. Althea walked to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, the flashing cameras, the raised iPhones. She slid the prepared speech she'd been given to the side, its talk of leveraging assets and shareholder value suddenly feeling woefully inadequate. "Good morning," she began, her voice resonating with a power that immediately silenced the room. "Yesterday, Sterling Airlines was acquired by Phoenix Equity Group. Today our work begins. Many of you are here to ask about balance sheets, debt restructuring, and profit margins, and we will get to that. But I want to talk about a different kind of asset, one that is far more valuable and has been, I fear, deeply mismanaged. I'm talking about our culture." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the expected script. "An airline is not a collection of planes," she continued, her eyes scanning the room. "It is a collection of people. It is the gate agent who calms a nervous flyer. It is the baggage handler working in the rain. It is the pilot who holds hundreds of lives in her hands. It is the flight attendant who has the power to make a passenger feel welcomed, safe, and respected, or to make them feel small, insulted, and invisible." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Yesterday, on my first flight as the owner of this company, I had an experience. It was not an experience of respect. It was an experience that I know for a fact many of our customers, particularly our customers of color, have endured silently for far too long. It was an experience that a company culture rotten with complacency and a tolerance for disrespect allowed to happen. She didn't give details. She didn't name Brenda. She didn't have to. She was speaking to a much larger issue. That ends today. My first act as the head of this airline was to terminate an employee who failed to meet the basic standard of human decency. My second act, which began at 8 a.m. this morning, is a full-scale audit and overhaul of every department in this company that has allowed this culture to fester. We will not be putting a coat of fresh paint on a crumbling house. We are rebuilding from the foundation up. Our new Sterling Airlines will be built on one principle above all others: respect. Respect for our customers, respect for our employees, and respect for the dignity of every single person who steps onto one of our planes. To those employees who share this vision, she concluded, her voice ringing with passion, I say welcome to a new day. Your work will be valued and your voices will be heard. To those who believe they can cling to the old ways, who believe that their seniority or their connections protect them from the standards of basic decency, I say the clock is ticking. You are on the wrong side of history, and you are in the wrong company. Sterling Airlines is charting a new course. I invite you all to watch us fly. She stepped back from the podium to a stunning silence, followed by an explosion of camera shutters and shouted questions. She had turned a corporate press conference into a declaration of war, a war on mediocrity, on prejudice, on the quiet, corrosive rot that had nearly brought a legacy airline to its knees. Meanwhile, in a sterile, windowless conference room at Sterling's corporate headquarters near LaGuardia, Mark Jenkins was living the worst day of his life. He sat across a long table from Sarah Chen. In front of her were 2 stacks of personnel files. One stack was nearly 2 feet high. The other contained just a single thin folder. This large stack, Mark Sarah began, her voice devoid of emotion, represents every complaint lodged against your in-flight staff over the past 5 years that was dismissed with a note like, passenger was difficult, attendant was having a bad day, or my personal favorite, no merit. The other stack, she said, tapping the lonely folder, is the number of complaints that resulted in disciplinary action. Do you see the problem here, Mark? Jenkins felt a cold dread pool in his stomach. The ripple effect of Flight 812 wasn't just a story on the news, it was a tidal wave, and it was about to wash him and his entire corrupt department out to sea. The audit was not an audit, it was an autopsy. For 3 days, Sarah Chen and a hand-picked team of HR specialists from Phoenix Equity Group lived in that conference room, fueled by coffee and a cold sense of purpose. They were corporate archaeologists digging through layers of digital and paper sediment to unearth the fossils of a toxic civilization. Mark Jenkins was required to be present for every moment of it. He was not a participant. He was a spectator at the public dissection of his own career. They discovered that Brenda Walsh was not an anomaly. She was an archetype. There was a flight attendant based in Chicago who had numerous complaints filed against him for homophobic remarks. There was a senior purser in the international division with a documented history of sexually harassing junior female colleagues. There was a whole crew based out of Dallas that was notorious for its hostility towards non-English speaking passengers. In every case, the pattern was the same. A passenger or a junior employee would file a formal complaint. The complaint would travel up a short chain of command and land on the desk of a manager, and often ultimately on the desk of Mark Jenkins himself. And there it would die. The files were a graveyard of silenced voices. Jenkins's handwritten notes in the margins were the most damning evidence. On a detailed complaint about the homophobic flight attendant, Jenkins had scrawled, "Steve is old school. Passenger probably just overly sensitive," on a tearful letter from a young attendant. About the lecherous purser, he had written, "He's just a flirt." She needs to toughen up if she wants to make it in this business. And on 3 separate complaints against Brenda Walsh for aggressive and racially biased behavior, he had simply noted, "Brenda is one of our most experienced. Handled. Nothing was ever handled." For Jenkins, these people were not liabilities. They were his tribe. They were the old guard, the ones who had been there for decades, who remembered the glory days. They were his allies, his friends. He had protected them, and in turn, they had protected him, creating a fortress of mediocrity that was immune to accountability. On the 4th day, Althea Washington entered the conference room. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and failure. The walls were covered in whiteboards, mapping out networks of complicity with lines and arrows that all seemed to point in one way or another toward the man sweating at the end of the table. Althea didn't speak to Jenkins at first. She walked slowly around the room, reading the whiteboards, her expression unreadable. She picked up a file, read the complaint, then read Jenkins's dismissive note. She put it down and picked up another, and another. Finally, she pulled up a chair and sat directly across from him. Jordan Vance and Sarah Chen stood behind her, a silent, formidable chorus. 217 formal complaints, Althea said, her voice soft, which was somehow more terrifying than if she had shouted. 217 times a customer or one of your own employees reached out, reporting behavior that was racist, sexist, homophobic, or just plain abusive. And in over 90% of those cases, the response from your department, from your desk, was to protect the abuser and dismiss the victim. Is that an accurate summary of your tenure as Vice President of In-Flight Services, Mr. Jenkins, who had rehearsed a dozen different speeches full of blustering defenses and corporate jargon, found that his throat had closed up? He opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. He looked like a man who had been caught in a house fire of his own making. The procedures, he stammered. Don't talk to me about procedures. Althea snapped, her voice suddenly sharp as glass. Procedures are for people who lack judgment. This isn't about a failure of process. This is about a catastrophic failure of character. Your character. You didn't just manage a department, Mr. Jenkins. You curated a culture of fear for the people who needed your help, and a culture of impunity for the people who caused the harm. You were not a manager. You were a gatekeeper of a private club, and the price of admission was a willingness to look the other way. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. Brenda Walsh was your creation. You gave her the soil, the water, and the shade she needed to grow for 17 years. Her disrespect for me on that flight was just a blossom from the poisonous tree that you planted and nurtured. The responsibility for her actions is hers. The responsibility for the system that empowered her, that is all yours. Jenkins finally broke. The pathetic, cornered anger of a man with no cards left to play flared in his eyes. This airline was fine. Before you got here, he spat. We had a family. We looked out for each other. You come in here with your Ivy League attitude and your fancy money, and you don't understand how things work on the ground. A family. Althea's laugh was short and brutal. You think this is a family? Some families are dysfunctional, Mr. Jenkins. Some are abusive. And the job of a responsible adult is not to enable the abuse, but to stop it. And as for my attitude is that this company is a business, not a clubhouse, and your members-only policies have cost this business millions in goodwill and driven away countless customers. She stood up. The finality of the gesture was unmistakable. Sarah will now walk you through the details of your termination, Althea said, turning to leave. It is effective immediately. You will be escorted from the building. Do not contact any Sterling employees. Do not attempt to access any company systems. You are done here. She paused at the door and looked back at the broken man at the table. And one more thing. You mentioned I don't understand how things work on the ground. You're wrong. I understand perfectly. I understand that people like Maria on my flight, good decent people who want to do their jobs well, have been held back and demoralized by bullies that you protected. My loyalty is to them now. The purge, as some of your friends are calling it, is not about punishment. It's about liberation. She walked out without another word. The firing of Mark Jenkins was the shot heard round the company. It was followed by a swift, precise series of dismissals. The homophobic flight attendant in Chicago, the lecherous purser, the entire management structure of the Dallas base. It was a corporate bloodbath carried out with the cold efficiency of a military coup. A week later, Althea sent a company-wide email. It announced the immediate promotion of Maria Garcia to the newly created role of Director of In-Flight Experience and Cultural Development. It detailed the launch of a new anonymous whistleblower program managed by an outside firm, and it laid out the philosophy of the new Sterling ending with a single, powerful line. Your performance will be judged not by who you know, but by how you act when you think no one is watching. The fortress had been breached. The old guard had been deposed. For the first time in a long time, there was sunlight in the corridors of Sterling Airlines. Brenda Walsh's world did not unravel. It shattered like cheap glass. The first week was a blur of shock and denial. She stayed inside her small, tidy condo in a faceless Atlanta suburb, the blinds drawn, the television murmuring. She expected a call. A mistake had been made. Someone from the union, or maybe even Mark Jenkins, would call and say it was all a misunderstanding, a suspension perhaps, but not this. The call never came. Instead, the letter did. A crisp corporate envelope containing the legal confirmation of her termination for gross misconduct. It outlined in cold, sterile language the forfeiture of her unvested pension and the immediate cancellation of her health insurance and flight benefits. The flight benefits were the cruelest cut. For 30 years, first at a regional carrier, then 17 at Sterling, her identity had been interwoven with the ability to fly, to hop on a plane to Paris for the weekend, to visit her sister in Seattle for free. It was her one perk, her symbol of status. Now she was grounded, permanently. When the denial curdled into rage, she decided to fight back. She cashed in a small annuity and found a labor lawyer, a man named Bob, who operated out of a strip mall office. She sat across from him, her story a torrent of righteous indignation. She painted herself as the victim, a loyal, long-serving employee, ambushed by an arrogant, power-tripping corporate raider. Bob the lawyer listened patiently, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finally ran out of steam, he put down his pen and looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "So let me get this straight, Ms. Walsh," he said slowly. "You refused service to a passenger in first class multiple times. You lied to her about the availability of glassware. You then verbally abused her when she called you on it. And this all happened before you knew who she was." "She was provoking me," Brenda insisted. "She had an attitude." And then the lawyer continued ignoring her protest after she identified herself as the new owner of the company. Your response was to scream that she was a lunatic and needed to be restrained. And there were other first-class passengers who witnessed this entire exchange. Is that a fair summary? Brenda's righteous fury faltered. Well, when you put it like that, there is no other way to put it, Bob said, sighing. Ms. Walsh, you don't have a case. You have a catastrophe. You're lucky they haven't filed a civil suit against you for defamation or intentional infliction of emotional distress. They paid you severance you weren't even entitled to just to make you go away. My professional advice to you is to take what's left of your money, go home, and pray that your name doesn't become the new dictionary definition of how to get fired. She left his office in a daze. The world now seemed sharp and hostile. The safety net she had always taken for granted, the union, the friendly managers, the system she knew how to work, was gone. She was 58 years old, with a skill set tailored to a single industry, and she was now infamous within it. She tried applying for jobs at other airlines. The moment they saw Sterling Airlines' 17 years on her resume, a polite but firm wall went up. No one would say it, but she knew. Her story, the incident on 812V, was a cautionary tale told in every airline break room in the country. She was a pariah. She took a job as a cashier at a Home Depot. The work was mind-numbing, the pay a fraction of what she once made. The vibrant red vest felt like a clown costume. She, who had once patrolled the exclusive aisles of first class, was now asking people if they wanted to apply for a store credit card. The humiliation was a physical weight. The customers were a constant stream of the people she had once looked down upon, people who didn't dress a certain way or speak a certain way. And she had to be nice to them. She had to smile and say, "Have a nice day," her voice a hollow echo of the practiced charm she once wielded as a weapon. One afternoon, a young black couple came through her line, buying paint and supplies for what was clearly their first home. They were laughing, excited, their joy infectious. Brenda watched them, a toxic mix of envy and resentment churning in her gut. She scanned their items, her movements stiff and resentful. "Did you find everything okay?" she asked, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "We sure did," the young man said, with a beaming smile. "Just bought our first house." A little nervous, a lot excited. He looked at his wife, his eyes full of love. "We're painting the nursery." Brenda didn't respond. She finished the transaction in sullen silence. As they were leaving, the woman paused. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle. "Are you okay? You seem like you're having a really bad day." The unexpected kindness was more devastating than any insult. It was the simple human decency she had so casually denied Althea Washington. And in that moment, looking at this happy young woman, offering her a moment of grace, Brenda finally understood. The problem had never been Althea. It had never been the passengers or the world changing around her. The problem was the bitterness in her own heart, the poison she had mistaken for power. Later that night, she sat in her dark living room, the television on, but the volume off. A news report came on CNN. It was a business segment on the Sterling turnaround. They showed images of new planes, happy employees, and glowing customer reviews. They interviewed a bright, articulate young executive, the new director of in-flight experience, Maria Garcia. Then they showed a brief clip of the new owner, Dr. Althea Washington, christening a new plane. She was smiling, surrounded by a diverse group of pilots and flight attendants. She looked powerful, yes, but also happy. She was building something better. Brenda watched the screen, and for the first time, the rage was gone. All that was left was a vast, empty ache. It was the crushing weight of hard karma, the realization that the world had moved on and improved not in spite of her, but precisely because she and the hateful system she represented had been left behind. She had spent her life serving people at 30,000 feet, but she had never once learned how to be a decent human being on the ground. And now she was grounded in every sense of the word, left with nothing but the bitter consequences of her own choices. 1 year later, Althea Washington sat in seat 3F on Sterling Airlines Flight 227 from New York to San Francisco. She purposely booked seats in economy, plus, or even the main cabin from time to time, flying unannounced. She called it ground truthing. It was one thing to read reports and approve strategies from a corner office. It was another to feel the results herself. The airline she was flying on was barely recognizable from the one she had acquired. The tired blue and gray interiors had been replaced with a sophisticated palette of deep charcoal silver and a vibrant, hopeful color they called Phoenix Red. The uniforms were modern and stylish, but the most profound change was in the atmosphere. The flight attendants on this flight, a man named Leo and a woman named Chloe, were a study in the new Sterling culture. They were efficient but warm, professional but personable. Leo, a young, sharply dressed black man, noticed a child a few rows up was growing fussy. Instead of ignoring it, he crouched down in the aisle. "Hey there, Captain," he said with a conspiratorial grin. "Looks like you're about to fly through some bumpy air. I have a top-secret mission for you. Can you help me count all the red lights on the wing? It's very important for our flight." The child, distracted and intrigued, immediately stopped crying and pressed his face to the window. The parents looked at Leo with pure, unadulterated gratitude. Althea watched the exchange with a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. This was it. This was the why Maria had spoken of. It wasn't just about checklists and procedures anymore. It was about connecting with people. Later, as Chloe came through the cabin with the beverage cart, Althea simply asked for a cup of tea. Chloe smiled warmly. "Of course, hot water with a slice of lemon? Or would you like me to brew it for you with the bag in?" It was a small thing, a tiny detail, but it was everything. It was the offer of a choice, a small gesture of personalized care that cost the airline nothing, but gave the passenger a feeling of being seen. It was the polar opposite of a plastic cup delivered with contempt. "Brewed would be lovely, thank you, Chloe," Althea said. She spent the flight working, but also listening. She heard the relaxed, friendly chatter between the crew and passengers. She saw an elderly woman being treated with patience and kindness as she struggled with her carry-on. She saw a group of college kids being laughed with, not at. This was the airline she had envisioned, an airline built not just on getting people from point A to point B, but on a foundation of dignity. The legend of Flight 812 had become a cornerstone of the new company culture. It was part of the onboarding for every new employee. Not to shame Brenda Walsh, but as a powerful real-world lesson in what happens when a company loses its way and the awesome responsibility that comes with wearing the Sterling uniform. It was a story about how one person's actions can reflect on everyone, and how true power lies not in authority, but in service. As the plane began its descent over the San Francisco Bay, the golden light of late afternoon streaming through the window, Althea put away her work. She looked out at the clouds, the brewed cup of tea warming her hands. She thought about the journey of the past year, the hostile takeover that had become a moral crusade, the firing of one woman that had led to the liberation of thousands, The financial projections and the debt restructuring were on track, and the stock price was climbing steadily. The business was a success. But as she sat there, an anonymous passenger in a comfortable seat, being cared for by a happy and respectful crew, she knew the real victory was something that could never be quantified on a balance sheet. She hadn't just bought an airline, she had given it back its soul. And as the wheels touched down smoothly on the runway, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. The new Sterling Airlines had truly taken flight. And that's how a single act of prejudice at 30,000 feet triggered a revolution in the corporate world. This story is a powerful reminder that the person you look down on today might just be the one signing your paycheck tomorrow. It's about more than just one flight attendant. It's about the hidden rot of toxic culture and the courage it takes for one leader to say, "No more." The real karma isn't just about Brenda's downfall, but about the rise of a better, more respectful company in its place. What did you think of Althea's actions? Was it justice, or was it too harsh? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to see it, and make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next real-life drama.